yeah, not really. I suppose what interests me is whatever I'm interested in at the moment. So, but it's also, I guess, a kind of commitment to responding to what's happening, rather than like isolating oneself. And I mean, it's also very desirable. I mean, I can't imagine anything more desirable than sitting in a room and reading books for 40 years. But there are other things going on. Yeah, I mean, I think in practical terms and in recent historical terms, there has actually, been a huge upswing in interest in feminist ideas and feminist activism, partly in response to, I guess, ongoing inequalities and also reversals in women's fortune, whether it be in employment or in terms of reproductive rights or in terms of sexual harassment, and in a global sense, the kind of questions of female feticide and female genital mutilation, and all of these things that you might have thought might have been solved historically, or overturned or abolished, have not been. So I think actually, when I wrote that book, which is now a long time ago, what I was writing about was the end of a recent era, really, because it was written before austerity and actually before some things became clearer, I suppose, in terms of the kind of cultural and ideological positioning. It didn't actually need all of this cultural stuff, in order to construct this image of the female worker, that actually that was for a period where there was more, I don't know, economic stability, actually, and that austerity made it much clearer that, this is not really about, we don't need this ideological supplement anymore, that actually it's much more bleak, how people have to work and sell their labour power and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I would say in that sense, then I think, feminism as a form of activism and a politics and a political subject has become much more visible again, actually. And when I was talking in the book about where is it gone, this was, reflecting back, and actually, after 2010, really, or maybe 2009, 2010. Of course, there are feminist activists all the time as well, I should remember. But I guess there's a kind of mainstreaming of feminism. I would say there's kind of quite a lot of confusion, though, within feminism at the moment still. And I think, kind of various branches of feminism, when we think about liberal feminism and what I was trying to describe as a kind of complicity with not just me, other people, Nancy Fraser and Hester Eisenstein and various other people, but diagnosing a kind of complicity, unintentional perhaps, with capitalism but also a kind of consumerism and a kind of liberal feminism which might celebrate supposed empowerment and a particular market for female embodiment. I mean, that's still very present, and I think that's a very dominant, particularly online, kind of form of feminism, so-called feminism. And there are big tensions. There are big tensions within thinking about liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, radical feminism. And there's still, I think the ground for those is really set in the 1970s, and actually people keep circling back to the same kinds of questions. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think in terms of a kind of diagnosis and a kind of rigorous analysis of, what capitalism is, what labour power is, what time is, what freedom is, if communism is free time and nothing else, then these are still kind of, the main questions, if you like. I mean, despite all the transformations in work or, global asymmetries, many of which are still the same, really. I think, as a way of explaining the particular economic form under which we live and suffer, and in terms of profit generation, surplus profit, it's still accurate, I suppose, would be the main reason, that it still explains more than other attempts to explain what's happening. So it doesn't mean, of course, that you wouldn't supplement Marx with feminism, for example, or with understanding developments in technology or global questions or questions of race and all these things that Marxists now, is often for a long time really been criticised for sidelining. But I think the fundamental approach, cuts through the ideology, precisely is an attempt to explain what ideology is, and cuts through the kind of sort of bourgeois idealism that still remains in different forms, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the way this discussion is being put at the moment is quite sort of vulgar, as if there's sort of like reductive class, it's kind of economism on the one hand, and then sort of identity struggles which are around gender, race, sexual identity, whatever. And and I think that opposition was never true of Marxism or Marx. And I think, in fact, sometimes these debates are. Very too simply, they're polarized. Online space actually polarizes these positions in very kind of extreme ways, and I think, but because online does allow for a particular kind of identitarian politics, both negatively and positively, and I would say they're kind of not in opposition, but the way in which those sort of antagonisms relate to one another, it's not that they're kind of reducible to one another. It's like, race is the modality in which classes lived, something like Stuart Hall's approach. They're not separable, in the way that sometimes they're positioned as either you're interested in class or you're interested in, I don't know, other forms of identity or antagonism. I think that, they're not separable. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I've been thinking about this a bit because, I mean, although generation identity isn't very big in Britain at the moment, but I've read the manifesto, and I can see sort of where they're trying to go, what this thing is trying to do. And of course, we're living in a period where ethno-nationalist identitarianism is on the rise again. It's always on the rise, but it's absolutely being pushed, whether it's in North America or in, parts of Europe or most of Europe, or, and I think and it would be tempting, of course, to conflate left identitarianism with right identitarianism, and the difficult question would be to say how and why they're different, and actually it's important that we say they're different. And I think we would have to say that even if we disagreed with some aspects of kind of left identitarianism, or if we even want to use this term identity politics, because it's kind of, like I said, we shouldn't, I don't know, it's not that there's nothing of value in this point. These kind of claims about identity exist for a reason, if we're looking at who is neglected, who is treated badly, who is treated worse on the basis of, particular things that are attributed to them. And I think the difference comes when we're thinking about identity as a form of oppression and identity as a form of kind of self-assumed superiority. That's one huge difference. Being treated differently on the basis of race is something that comes from the outside, is an oppression that is, is also mingled with exploitation. So you're badly on the basis of race and on the basis that you're a worker. But saying that you're a part of a superior race because you are a white-skinned person in Northern Europe is not at all a form of oppression. But it's one thing that's also difficult about this is that lots of fascism, neo-fascism and identitarian politics, such as the Generation Identity Manifesto and that whole project, is predicated on a certain logic of victimhood. That fascists always think they're the victims. They're the victims of immigration, they're the victims of policies, they're the victims of women, they're the victims of, and actually I think anti-feminism is so central to a fascist identity that we actually need to think very specifically about that particular relation. It's true all the way through the history of fascism, that kind of women are perceived in some sense to be not only inferior but also somehow oppressive towards men, and that, that actually, of course there are female fascists, but the part of this kind of masculinist logic is a kind of very central to a kind of fascist self-image. About being a hard body, and someone like Klaus Taverlight in Male Fantasies is very important for this analysis of the SS. And I've been reading a lot about Gabriele D'Annunzio, who's a kind of proto-fascist, Italian sort of ethno-nationalist thinker before Mussolini. And these things are absolutely kind of integral. And I think we have to precisely oppose maybe forms of internationalism, universalism, like you say, but very qualified forms, something like Fanon's, new humanism, which is precisely a humanism that takes into account the history of violence, the history of colonialism, slavery, so on, that doesn't posit some kind of, some Enlightenment, universalism that is in fact actually just a cover story from yet more bourgeois expectation, but is a real universalism. So I think, how do we oppose this self-victimizing identitarianism of the right is to propose a strong, form of new universalism, new internationalism, and so on. But it's a very difficult, where is the ground for that? What do we do when the fascists are gaining quite a lot of ground, actually? Because ethno-nationalism is always a very cheap shortcut to, playing with people's resentment and hatred and, desire to feel better than somebody else. Yeah. Well, I think this is a very, important question, and I think we are right to be wary, of course, like I was saying, about sort of blank humanisms, that actually want to get rid of difference, that actually don't understand that people are oppressed as well as exploited, that actually want to be reductive, and also ahistorical. We can't have ahistorical forms of universalism in history, and and I think Marx doesn't neglect the history of slavery, for example. Primitive accumulation is this description of that violent form of kind of possession and private, making private of property at the expense of particular groups of people. So it's a new universalism. I'm very interested in this and in internationalism, and especially in relation to like the refugee crisis and so on. What does it mean to have a internationalist humanism or humanitarianism almost that doesn't kind of reinforce the categorization of groups of people into, physically into camps and temporally into limbo, and existentially into, people who are both victims and threats at the same time. What's the humanism of the refugee from the standpoint of North America or Europe? What would be the humanism that started from the refugee, for example? Not just the figure of the refugee as some kind of symbolic metaphor, but actually, the real presence and lives of refugees who are in camps all over, in Europe. And something like this, what would a humanism of the refugee be? Yeah, well, we'll see. I think the result of the general election was very interesting and also very funny in many ways, because it was a total reversal of what both people on the left and right thought would happen. And I don't know if Corbyn's success is really. The question of the role of Brexit in Corbyn's relative success, and of course they didn't win. Although John McDonnell said another 2 weeks and we would have won. And this is possibly true. There was a kind of real upsurge, and particularly among young people, many of whom, registered to vote, specifically to vote for Corbyn, and, and after all the kind of backlash and backbiting in the party and, the kind of centre-right and the centre of the Labour Party just kind of totally trying to eliminate him all the time. And, and I think what Corbyn does represent, and anyone who's, like, been involved in any activism or organising in Britain knows him personally, right? Because he is there. He's been there for 40 years. He speaks at everyone's conferences and events. He goes to, and I think what he represents is consistent social democratic principles, and he voted against the Iraq War. He voted, so even within the party, this party, who are by any, any description, basically functionally neoliberal warmongering party, just slightly to the left of the Conservatives, but actually he and John McDonnell were the kind of two people who were, constantly fighting, insofar as they could from within this position. So there's something very interesting about that, because what Corbyn does represent, although it's possibly an older image of social democracy, so, the right attacked him over a million things, but one of them was he's going to drag us back to the 1970s. But if you're telling people who are born in the 1990s that they're going to be dragged back to the 1970s, and they say, well, what was the 1970s like? And say, well, there was nationalised railway, there was good music, people had more it's like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. So actually you can't use the thread of 1970s. And what they mean by that, obviously, is like the strikes. When actually, like, Labour had more power, and, Labour as in the working class, were more unionisers, more organised, before Thatcher crushed and destroyed, and legally and illegally, all of those, people, and the change to legislation. So, yeah, what's interesting about it is that he does kind of represent an older image of a possibility for social democracy, which is very interesting in 2017, because it's not really what people expected. People imagined there'd be some young, thrusting, I don't know, more slick media type, not some kind of like
Macron.
Yeah, right. That's the only way you can get even as tiny modicum of, centrist politics, let alone left-wing politics, was to have someone who was slick and shiny. But actually, no, you have someone who's like a 70-year-old geography teacher who makes jam from his allotment. Yeah. And actually, there's something very interesting about this image of masculinity that Corbyn represents, which I'm very fascinated by, because he was described for so long, right up until the result, as too weak, too nice, lovely guy, but, not a leader. But actually, he managed to turn that around and actually make these kind of listening and gentleness and gardening and all of these things into actually another image of what it means to be like a leader, right? So I hope that it can happen all over Europe. I hope that everyone has their own Corbyn.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. No, absolutely. They have no credibility whatsoever now. The whole situation is so uncertain, and what Brexit means is so uncertain. It was uncertain before, it's even more uncertain now. And yeah, people were saying they might need to call another election soon, because it's, I don't know. I thought it would be more unstable after the general election in the last few months than it is. But I think, unfortunately, there's enough kind of inertial stability in British politics that even this disruption hasn't had that much effect, at the social level. But we'll see, hopefully next election.